This eConference, of course, is coming to you from the Broken Bay Institute, and a reminder that there are courses available online if you would like to further your studies through any number of other theological pursuits. On the screen now, you can see the details of making contact with the BBI and finding out more about the wide range of courses that are currently offered. And I remind you once more that the e-conferences are all available on DVD, again by contacting the Broken Bay Institute. As we continue our presentation, we move back to hear from Sister Michele Connolly RSJ. She is, of course, a nun of the Sisters of St. Joseph, the order that was founded by Mother Mary MacKillop, now Saint Mary MacKillop of the Cross. She's currently the Academic Dean of the CIS and has a range of other teaching experiences behind her. She's going to talk to us now about Jesus crucified and also raised, where heaven and earth meet. But just ahead of that, she's going to take one of the many questions that we're happy to say you have been sending to us. Sister Michele.
Thanks very much, Mike. It's good to be back with you. I'm just going to respond, I think, to one question. This is a question that you will often hear about the Gospel of Mark. Could I please talk a little bit on the Messianic secret? Why were the disciples directed not to proclaim Jesus as the Christ? One of the things that everybody knows is this expression, the Messianic secret. This expression was actually really came into existence over a century ago when a scholar wrote a book trying to make sense of the fact that in many places in the Gospel according to Mark, Jesus tells people not to say who he is. There have been all sorts of theories, and I think the word secret makes people feel that there is some secret, and if only the biblical scholars would decode it, then we really would have salvation in our hands. It's unfortunate that really that's not available. What I can say is that I would think that possibly, and I think Frank indicated this, Jesus very possibly said to the disciples and sometimes to people that he healed, like the Gadarene demoniac, and others, don't tell what has happened here. The reason being that some of the ways that people spoke about Jesus caused problems for him because people misinterpreted what he was doing. So it's possible that in reality, Jesus wanted people not to make grand announcements until he had sufficiently prepared the way, explaining really what he meant about God and about the reign of God and about who he was, and in particular that as Messiah, he was one who would have to suffer, that it was entirely proper that the Messiah would suffer. But that took a lot of preparation. Jesus did not want that announced before people would understand it, so that he still could preach and at least try to communicate something to people. The other thing that is happening is I think Mark highlights it in the way that he tells his gospel, because as Frank said at the beginning, talking about the ancient Greek stories, one of the things that they were fascinated in was identity. And many of the ancient Greek narratives were really constructed on an identity that the audience knew at the beginning, and then the whole story, the fascination of the story was how did the person discover their identity? If it is through the tragedy of killing your father and marrying your mother, then that's a tragedy, and that's how Oedipus Rex finds out who he is. If it is something of a bedroom farce, then it's a comedy, and there are both kinds of writings in the ancient Greek world. So Mark tells us at the beginning who Jesus is in the very, very first verse. Jesus, the Son of God, the Messiah. We know that from the beginning, but the people who are in the story don't know it. The fact that Jesus' full identity is suppressed in a way in the telling of the story makes it to be a climactic moment in Mark 14:61-62, which is towards the end when Jesus is on trial and the high priest says, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus says, "Yes, and you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven." So all of a sudden here, where Jesus is on trial, he declares fully what his identity is. Of course, actually, there is still more of Jesus' identity to be revealed, and that's what I want to talk about in my next presentation. So I'll just move on from there to say that what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about three major events in Jesus' life that are placed, as Frank has said, at the beginning and the middle and the end of the story. then within that structure, I want to show you a central section in closer detail. And Frank has already told us about that central section. What that does is it shows Mark's gospel of the way of suffering, shows how that culminates in resurrection. So I'm going to show you a chart that builds up, and I want to show you 3 events of Jesus's that happened to Jesus in this gospel, that are Jesus's baptism, his transfiguration, and his death and resurrection. So you can see that on the slide in front of you, the headings across the front. Below the headings, you can see for each of them the chapter and verse references, so you can see that they occur in chapter 1, in chapter 9 and in chapter 15, these 3 events. They really are the beginning and the middle and the end. The next thing you can see on the chart is that at each of those 3 events, something is said about Jesus' identity. In the first one, we get the expression, "You are my son, the beloved." In the middle one, we get, "This is my son, the beloved." And at the third one, we get, "Truly, this man was God's son." So we see here that Jesus is focused on in a very particular way. In the first 2 times, it is a voice from heaven that claims Jesus as beloved son. At the baptism, Jesus is depicted as speaking solely to Jesus, saying to him, "You are my beloved son, with you I am well pleased." What the gospel writer does here is he lets us eavesdrop on this scene so that we know that Jesus begins his public ministry with all of God's favour resting on him. When we come to the Transfiguration scene, the voice that from the cloud speaks not to Jesus but about him. The voice speaks to those who are with Jesus, saying to the disciples, commanding them to listen to Jesus, who was God's beloved son. By this stage, they were very much under threat of not listening to Jesus. So they are directed from heaven to listen to Jesus. The third time, at the cross, because we've heard at the baptism and at the transfiguration a voice speaking from heaven telling us who Jesus is, we might expect a voice from heaven to speak again telling us who Jesus is. But what happens is it is the centurion who supervised the execution of Jesus, and Mark says to us very plainly, when this centurion, an experienced Roman soldier, saw the way that Jesus died standing opposite him, so he had a clear view, the centurion says, "Truly, this was a son of God." So the change of voice here surprises us. It's very ironic that it's a Gentile, a Roman executioner, who announces to us Jesus' true identity. So there are other features that we can see in all three of these events that show that Jesus is a strong point of connection between heaven and earth. In the baptism scene, as you can see here in the graphic, I hope, one of the things that we are told is that as Jesus comes up out of the water, he sees the heavens torn open, and from these heavens the voice calls him the beloved Son. So in a very, very graphic way, Mark shows that Jesus, standing in the waters of the Jordan on the earth, is able to look straight up into the heavens torn open, so that Jesus is a point of connection between heaven and earth. I think that's very, very important for Mark's Gospel, and we must remember the word torn. In the second story, a cloud overshadows those who are on the mountain with Jesus, and in here it is as though heaven has come down onto the mountaintop, and meeting with Jesus are Moses and Elijah, who have come from heaven as though to consult with Jesus. At the third scene, at the cross scene, it is not the heavens that are torn open, so Mark says, but the curtain of the temple. Now, there's an image there on your screen of the curtain of the temple. Ancient commentators tell us that this curtain was embroidered with an image of the whole of the heavens. So in effect, the heavens were there, and Mark deliberately uses the word torn. They were torn. It was a very large curtain, perhaps as much as 80 feet in height, and that curtain was torn in two from top to bottom. Now, the important thing is that this curtain hung in front of the Holy of Holies in the temple in Jerusalem. This was a very, very special place in the temple where the people of Jesus' tradition believed that the presence of God dwelt. At the very moment that Jesus breathes his last breath, Mark tells us, the curtain of the temple is torn in two. What we hear, what happens, I think, for us as we listen to this, with the image of the crucifixion of Jesus in our minds, is that the image of God's presence that is newly impressed, if you like, on the retina of our minds, of the way that God's presence is expressed to us, is the image of Jesus on the cross. This is a very radical, graphic move on the part of Mark. This is not an attractive image, especially if you lived in that time and really knew what that event was like. It's an extremely provocative theological move to say that the presence of God, now we learn to see, is given to us on the cross. What we learn to see is that these are the lengths that God in Jesus is prepared to go to convey God's love to us. Now, Mark prepares us to learn this very challenging spiritual vision of Jesus by the way he tells Jesus' journey to Jerusalem, from Galilee to Jerusalem, where Jesus was executed. The journey from Galilee in the north to Jerusalem in the south occurs in this central section of Mark, chapter 8:22 to 10:52. And as Frank has said, what happens in this section is we begin and end with the story of a blind man. In between the two stories of Jesus healing blind men, Jesus tries to bring his own hand-picked disciples to see God the way that Jesus sees God. Mark means us to see the great irony that while Jesus can heal the physically blind, Jesus' disciples, despite Jesus' concentrated efforts at teaching them, Jesus' disciples do not fully see what Jesus teaches them here. Now, Mark in this section uses a special name for Jesus to try to convey to us the meaning of Jesus' life and death and resurrection. It's a name you all know. It's the name Jesus as the Son of Man. It comes from Jesus' own religious tradition, Judaism. It's a name that could be used to mean human being or son of a human being. It was used in a number of the ancient texts of the Old Testament, often to mean human being, sometimes to mean a particular or special human being. Not long, or a century and a bit, nearly 2 centuries before the time of Jesus, a book was written in the Jewish tradition that's in the Bible, the book of Daniel. And this expression, the Son of Man, is used there to mean a heavenly figure who is like a human being. This figure has a particular role. He has a care for God's people when they suffer, but this figure gets presented in this story. This is the text you can see now of Daniel 7:13 to 14. As I watched in the night visions, I saw one like a human being coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. To him, this is the Son of Man, was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations and on the earth should serve him. So when Jesus is presented to the Ancient of Days in heaven, he is given this glory and kingship. So Mark is going to use this name, this understanding from the Old Testament, to explain the necessity of Jesus' suffering, but to explain also his death and his resurrection. So I want to see if we can build up a table on the screen now to show how Mark builds his theology of Jesus. So we start with the 2 texts of the blind men at chapter 8:22 and 10:52, as you can see there on the text. Then we can move and see that at those 2 texts, Jesus heals blind men. The first one he heals in stages. This is the man who thinks he first can see people, but they look like trees, and then he comes to see. The final one is the story of blind Bartimaeus. In between those 2 texts, which make like a frame, in the Gospel, we get 3 points where Jesus predicts his suffering, death and resurrection. And Frank has alluded to these. They're in chapters 8, 9 and 10, around about the verse 30. So in quite rapid succession, Mark has Jesus insist that it is necessary that he suffer and die, but also insist that he will be raised from the dead. So it's very important that we hear this insistence, as you can see there on the screen, 3 predictions of Jesus' passion. After that happens, or actually in between the first and the second, so as the disciples are being confronted with a very, very challenging lesson from Jesus, in between the first and the second, Mark gives us an image of Jesus on a mountain. And this image is, this is the Transfiguration Scene, where we see Jesus being portrayed in his true glory. For a moment, we see Jesus as he truly is. On a mountain, he's in the presence of heaven. The great figures of heaven come to consult with Jesus. For the disciples, I think this is meant to be a consolation, something that reassures them as they are coming to trying to come to terms with Jesus speaking to them very, very strangely about the necessity of his death and about the reality of his resurrection. We then, after we come to this, we find that in this section, Mark will then, before he comes to the story of the blind man being healed, we get told Jesus has a very, very strong message just before this, where in a story just before the 10:46 to 52 story, as Frank has said, 2 of the disciples come to Jesus, and as they're approaching Jerusalem, they've left Jericho, now they're approaching Jericho, which is the last stop before Jerusalem. So they are planning their careers, and they say to Jesus, right, we're 2 brothers, we've been with you since the beginning, you know we're good, we'd like you to give us positions, and they want to be the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Jesus says, not within my gift. But he then makes a very important point, and he says to them, you know that amongst the Gentiles, their great ones lord it over them and make their authority felt. This is not to happen among you. So Jesus gives that teaching in the midst of his stories of walking to Jerusalem, knowing that he is moving towards his own death and resurrection. And then the final scene is the scene of Bartimaeus just before we come to Jerusalem. All the way along that journey, Mark has been using the term the Son of Man, the Son of Man, the Son of Man, the Son of Man. At the very beginning of the Gospel, in that first verse, we hear Jesus, the Christ, the Son of God. But as the Christ, the Son of God, has made his journey to Jerusalem, we have constantly heard that sense of the Messiah being qualified by the use of this term, the Son of Man, a relatively recent term in Jewish history that has the sense of one who suffers or who identifies with God's suffering people, but to whom glory and dominion will be given. This is how Jesus qualifies the sense of what it is to be the Messiah that he is. So as we come to the very end, we see that Jesus heals blind Bartimaeus, who will throw off his cloak and follow Jesus on the way to Jerusalem. When we get to Jerusalem, along with Bartimaeus, we will see the death of Jesus on the cross. This, as Mark has prepared us to see, this is the place which becomes the new site for seeing where the presence of God is found. Somebody did ask a question about what Frank alluded to as the end of Jewish leadership that Jesus proclaims when he is in Jerusalem. There are some difficulties around this. I'd like to suggest that what this is about, we have to understand this in its context. As Frank said, this gospel is written either in the course of a war that took place from the years 66 to 70, or after the year 70. In that year 70, the temple in the city was captured and the temple in Jerusalem was completely destroyed. The temple where the Holy of Holies was completely destroyed by the Romans, a great act of barbarism. but they did it to utterly express to the Jewish people that the Romans had taken control. I think my own hunch is that whoever does this enormously imaginative work, the Gospel according to Mark, working on it, I think perhaps his own theological vision gels when, this is very speculative on my part, but what really brings it together is the loss of the temple. And what what Mark comes to see is, as I've suggested, that when the curtain of the temple is destroyed and we do not have that sense of God's presence dwelling in the Holy of Holies anymore, for the believers in Jesus, they see the presence of God in the crucified Jesus. So when Mark talks about Judaism and the Jewish leadership coming to its end, I think he's talking in the after effect of that actually having happened, of the temple having been destroyed. We who live 2,000 years later, we need to be aware that this does not legitimate anti-Semitism, and we must not use any text in the New Testament to do that. We have to realise what Mark is saying in context. What Mark is proposing is a dramatic, powerful new theological vision that God can be seen in the suffering human being with the background of the Isaiah 53 text, the one who is so disfigured by his suffering that it makes us want to turn our faces away. It is so ugly. What Mark wants to say is this is where we see God loving us in that context. So this is where really the journey of Jesus has brought us. Jesus journeying between the healing of 2 blind people, journeying along with disciples who are struggling to see, but we learn as we hear the story that Mark offers us that Jesus, the Son of the human being, suffers with us, he will die among us, but Mark utterly insists all the way through that this Jesus suffering with us and dying our death with us, this Jesus will be raised from the dead, as we are promised that those who are baptised into Jesus also will be raised to a life that the grave will not hold. Thank you.